Hi, I would like to introduce you to Samuel Freedman, who is a former New York Times columnist and a pro- professor. Are you a professor? Of in the journalism school at Columbia University, and who many of our students have seen the article he wrote about Gilad Shalit and the commandment to redeem captives. So he's going to talk to us a little bit about his study on that subject, and then we're going to have some dialogue after that.
Right. Thank you very much, Sharon, and thank you, Rabbi and students. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'll try to do the best I can via Zoom recording. So as Sharon was saying, I was a columnist writing about religion for the New York Times. I did that for 10 years, from 2006 to 2016. And to the degree possible, I tried to connect my columns to events in the news. And I should also explain the type of column it was. I wasn't an opinion columnist. I couldn't just write, here's what I think about ransoming Gilad Shalit or about anything else I wrote about. I was supposed to really write in a more explanatory, analytical way rather than purely offering my opinion. So in this case, I had been familiar, of course, as someone who's very attached to the Jewish community, has lots of friends in Israel, with the capture of Gilad Shalit and with what became this movement, not just in Israel, but very much in the diaspora, to keep his memory front of mind, to literally pray for him. I went to many, many Shabbat lunches and dinners and Yom Tov meals in the years of his captivity, when part of the order of service, so to speak, would be referring to often a picture of Gilad Shalit that many of my friends had, and also, reciting sometimes the liturgical verses about redeeming the captive. So as soon as the deal to ransom him for about 1,000 Hamas prisoners was executed, I knew it was something that I wanted to write about. And what struck me is that most of the reporting, and this is often the case when secular journalists try to write about religion, they default to the secular explanation. So there was a lot of talk about the, arithmetic of the trade, 1,000 terrorists who committed, many of them heinous acts, for one person. Does that make geopolitical sense or not? And totally legitimate question. But what was absent was the role that Judaic writing and Judaic commentary and Judaic teaching had in the Israeli mindset about not only redeeming Gilad Shalit, but other prisoners who'd been taken over the years, and sometimes just to get the remains of Israeli soldiers who had been killed, just so they could be properly and halachically buried back in Israeli soil. And so my interest was looking at at Pidyon Shvuim, and really kind of the several lines of interpretation about it, because as you know from reading the article, it sounds at first read like this is an absolute commandment. It is, mitzvah rabbah, a major mitzvah, a major commandment to redeem the captive. That injunction appears in several books of the Hebrew Bible. And yet there's also, in the Talmud and in other commentaries, been pushback on it, because there was an awareness, even in antiquity, that some people take captives to try to get disproportionate trades for them. That generally people don't take captives with the idea of doing a one-for-one trade. You would occasionally see that among, frankly, civilized nations, as in during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. When they would capture each other's spies, there would be trades for spies that generally were one person for one person, but never wildly disproportionate. But it's almost as if, many of our ancient commentators were aware not only of the humane necessity to attempt to redeem captives, but to the fact that some captors will manipulate the captivity in order to receive a disproportionate reward, whether it's a material monetary award or reward in terms of how many of their captives may be returned. And I can safely say that, at least in the circles I move in Jewish life in America, and from most of my Israeli friends and family members, and I have many, at the time Gilad Shalit was released in a trade for 1,000 Hamas prisoners, there was general approval of it. He was seen as kind of the emblem of every Israeli family's son who might be taken captive, and every Israeli parent and sibling would want to feel that their government would do anything to bring their loved one back. And even Prime Minister Netanyahu, who had written against the idea of, what he called rewarding terrorism in such trades, did go along with it, partly because he had religious approval, as you read in the article from one of the most important Sephardic rabbis in Israel. And it's strange, and in this case, incredibly painful, how the path of events changes the way we look at the redemption of Gilad Shalit. Because one of those 1,000 people who was returned to Gaza in that trade was Yahya Sinwar, who is a leader in Hamas and who was, by most accounts, the architect of the barbaric terrorist attack on southern Israel on October 7th. So the very person, or one of the very people who was returned to Gaza for Gilad Shalit, ended up helping to take 1,400 more lives a decade and a few years later, which goes to the moral and also strategic complexity of these cases. And that's what makes them so difficult to parse theologically and morally as well. How will we judge in the fullness of time the trade-off of Sinwar for Gilad Shalit? We'd be tortured to think that Gilad Shalit would have spent all these intervening years as Hamas's captive, but were tortured in a different way by the massacre of civilians. And, as a journalist, I also have a take on all this. I know that part of the reason you undertook the study was because of the Russian seizure of Evan Grishkovich, a fellow journalist. And in fact, one of my students last year at Columbia had worked with him in Moscow. So I felt just really one step removed from him.
We are.
I'm sorry?
And he's in Princeton, from Princeton. So.
Right.
A few miles from here. Yeah.
So all the more reason it feels very personal to you. And what it brought right to mind is someone I knew quite well, and this is long before you students were born, but perhaps Sharon and Rabbi remember this. There was an Associated Press reporter named Terry Anderson, who was held captive by a Shiite group, then called Amal, sort of the precursor to Hezbollah in Lebanon, for 7 years in the 1980s, and was finally released. I don't believe that there is a major disproportionate trade-off in that case, but for people who are in journalism, they were tormented by that. And I got to know Terry later because after he was released, he came and taught for a couple of years at Columbia Journalism School, and we even taught a class together. And I know this isn't exactly what you're talking about, but what was remarkable about Terry, and I'm not his psychotherapist, obviously, but is how intact he was able to keep himself. And I know from our conversations, as well as what Terry wrote in his book, in his memoir of his captivity, is that he'd never been a particularly religious person. He's a Christian, I believe Roman Catholic, but he turned to that a lot to sustain himself. It was one of the things that allowed him to bear up under the captivity. And he had many people advocating for him fiercely and trying, as Gilad Shalit's parents did, to pressure the American government to do more for him. He had a sister named Peggy Anderson who still lived in their community in upstate New York, who was righteously up in people's face in the media, talking to politicians all the time, demanding that they did something for Terry. And even people in Terry's hometown were very attached to him. And Peggy sometimes found it a little bit overwhelming and I know this may be a bad time for a grim joke, but I think this in a way sheds light on it. Terry later told me that on a bridge abutment near where he and his sister were from in upstate New York, someone spray painted "Free Terry, give them Peggy." So,
Not nice.
and the other thing that was really interesting about Terry is I never heard him express a desire for vengeance at all. He certainly wasn't someone who identified with his captors in what's called the Stockholm Syndrome, but he was not constructed in a way where he wanted a lot of blood shed on his behalf. I think he was just very grateful to get out. He had basically a marriage. They'd never gotten officially married, but his longtime girlfriend in Beirut gave birth to their child while he was in captivity. He'd never seen his daughter until he was released. So these are familiar, sad to say, situations for journalists as well. And if you think about also the basically the seizure of Brittany Griner, the WNBA star, on what were clearly totally trumped up, exaggerated charges of drug possession, that was Putin also playing a disproportionate game. Which is what I suspect he's doing with Evan, which is to take someone who a lot of Americans would care for, would want to have released, and he got an arms dealer traded for her. A pure civilian like Terry Anderson was, Brittany Griner being traded for someone who has contributed to international terror through his arms trading is not an equitable trade. But these are the terrible, terrible choices that we deal with and that Judaic teaching tries to help us weigh. And I think, the strength of Judaic teaching is that it's not just what's in the mitzvot, it's not just what's in the Shulchan Aruch, or in the Talmud, and the Talmud itself is nothing but a chronicle of disputation, that with all that, with commentaries, with Midrash, etc., we're always turning over these issues and weighing them, and instead of just stipulating, this is what you must do, even when it's a very strongly worded advisory, as in, Pidyon Shvuim, there are also counter arguments that are put forth, and you can only, have your heart go out and have your prayers go out to everyone involved in the situation with all the hostages in Gaza now, because they all have, probably virtually all of them have family and friends. I was at a Shabbat dinner 2 summers ago with Vivian Silver, who was a peace activist in her mid-70s who was seized. So this isn't too many steps away. One of her dearest friends is a very dear friend of mine. So you have people like that, and yet there's also recognition, and this is what makes it so painful, so hard, that Hamas has taken these hostages and is using them as leverage to try to stay in power, to try to stave off an Israeli ground invasion, or sometimes trying to use the leverage of letting a few hostages out as they have, and sometimes threatening to execute them, or saying without any confirmation that X many have already been killed in the Israeli bombing. So, in its, unspeakable way, Hamas also is very aware of the kind of currency you have when you're holding the captives of people who have loved ones.
Ironically, just recently, because I do Daf Yomi, we were studying in the Talmud about the whole issue with captives and the disputation between, if you only pay, sounds terrible, what if you were going to sell a person on the slave market, what they would be worth, and no more than that, because otherwise you're just encouraging the taking of more hostages, and we kind of see that playing itself out right now.
I think there's no question about that. I think that in seizing the hostages, I'm sure Hamas ran the math. If Gilad Shalit got us 1,000 or 1,100, we'll be able to get everyone from Hamas in an Israeli prison back, and maybe then some more if we hold 200 hostages. And the other thing is that Gilad Shalit in Israeli history, that was not an unusual proportion. One of the Israeli scholars I spoke to in the article I'm sorry, it was the journalist Bradley Burston, worked out the average in hostage redemptions, and the average was 800 Palestinian or other terrorist prisoners being released for every Israeli who was reclaimed. So that kind of ratio had been consistent. And again, I have to think that if Hamas spent all the years it obviously spent planning this, this pogrom, then they were probably also planning what their, price was going to be based on past practice.
I mean, Gilad Shalit, as terrible as that was in fact a soldier. We're talking now about babies and innocent civilians.
Exactly.
Which kind of presents a whole different, and even compared to journalists, I think when you're dealing with a soldier, you're dealing with somebody who was putting themselves in harm's way. Not so, maybe to a lesser degree journalists, but certainly not so civilians from their own homes. So.
Right. And I can even say with journalists, I certainly don't defend it. And there are great groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists that protest this all the time. But I think Terry never expected to be taken hostage, but he knew he was reporting in a terribly dangerous place at a terribly dangerous time. And I think good journalists think they'll be able to see the risks coming, but they don't always do it. David Rhodey of then the New York Times, now NBC News, who was taken hostage by the Taliban. Also, he was someone who'd been in a lot of war zones, who thought he knew how to keep his street smarts around him, and ended up getting enticed into his own capture. Now, he was able to escape, so that was, one of the rare cases where there was no ransom. But it also does speak to the fact that while journalists aren't combatants the way soldiers are, if you're a journalist in a very dangerous place, presumably you've gone in there to some degree with your eyes open. And as you said, Sharon, babies, elderly people, kids at the rave, peace activists, kibbutzniks were not people who were in the military prepared for the risks that entails.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question, because I think our kids are using social media and all the different technologies so much, and what your thought is, because Gilad Shalit was returned in I think it was 2011.
Right.
I guess there was Twitter, and maybe Instagram was very new. There was Facebook, but now when there's so much social media, how does that change kind of the situation?
Right. Well, I mean, the best analogy I can draw to that isn't Gilad Shalit. I'm pretty sure Instagram didn't exist in 2011. I think Twitter and Facebook were in their relative infancies. But the example I would use is the beheading of Daniel Pearl.
Right.
Daniel Pearl was a journalist for the Wall Street Journal who was based in Pakistan right after the Al-Qaeda attack on September 11th, and was reporting on Al-Qaeda's deep ties to Pakistani intelligence agencies. And he was taken captive, and he was beheaded by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, one of the people who planned the September 11th attacks. And Al-Qaeda released video of the beheading. They thought that it would scare the West. They thought it would rally people to their side. And I think a lot of Americans at that time, first of all, news organizations, almost all of them didn't show it. The one that first did was an alternative weekly in Boston called the Boston Phoenix. And I wrote an essay at that time arguing that people should look at that video, because you had to know the barbarity of the enemy, that you had to know why this was a fight that had to be fought. And it was not just the beheading of Daniel Pearl. He was Jewish, that he was made to recite kind of his entire family Jewish history before being beheaded. And the difference now is that whereas news organizations, much less the American military at that time, would hardly have wanted to promulgate that video. Now you have the IDF itself making the video of the greatest atrocities available to journalists, available to the UN, and trying to turn the tables on Hamas. The video, the ghastly video they've shown, is video Hamas itself shot of at the time people were being tortured and murdered. And so I think there's a sense now that all parties in this conflict are trying to use social media to, to put their case before their constituency, whether their constituency is the civilized world in the case of Israel, or whether their constituency is terrorist sympathizers in the case of Hamas. And that's incredibly, incredibly light years different from what the attitude was outside terrorist circles at the time of Daniel Pearl's assassination, which was, again, this goes back a long time. We're talking about probably late 2001.
But also there's maybe the inverse, which is that the campaign to free Gilad, used all the available media that they had. Now we have so many other avenues, and how that affect Israeli leaders, world leaders, because of course they're also nationals from other countries. It's not just
absolutely. No, I mean, when I go through my Facebook feed every night, I see photos of Israeli hostages. When I walk around the streets of the Upper West Side, my little shtetl in New York, I see the kidnapped posters up. Now, putting posters up is an older technology, but the idea is to put a face on the atrocity and to try to build up passion to argue for the release. And you've seen in Israel acts of public advocacy / art / protest in the form of the empty Shabbat table, in the form of the teddy bears with red meant to indicate blood on them in central Tel Aviv. And these are, in addition, of course, to the appeals of the family members of the captives, these are ways to try to personalize what's going on, to try to exert positive pressure on the government to achieve a release. And it all goes around the world in a second, which had not been the case in the past. With Gilad Shalit, it made its way. Facebook was around, Twitter was around, but it moved, in my recollection anyway, much more slowly in 2011 than now. I mean, within hours of the discovery of the extent of the terrorism on October 7th, I could just see in my Facebook feed photos and accounts already showing up, and it hasn't stopped. And I'm not on Twitter. My account got hijacked and Elon Musk won't let me get it back, which is probably just as well considering what he's like. But I can only imagine that if I'm seeing this on Facebook, that it's happening, at warp speed on Twitter.
Yeah. You mentioned we actually did learn about Daniel Pearl last year, not the same group of students, but in connection with the book of Daniel, ironically, we kind of were looking at the two different Daniels being to some harsh trials. Yeah, exactly. Do you think, in the case of both Daniel Pearl and Evan Gershkovich, do you think that these two men were targeted because they were Jews?
With Daniel Pearl, absolutely. With Evan Gershkovich, it's certainly possible. And I know that the Russian-American Jewish writer Julia Ioffe, in an essay of hers, definitely posited that, and pointing out that for someone as smart as Putin is, he was aware that seizing not just a Western journalist, but one who was a Jew would have a lot of appeal to the kind of Russian Christian nationalists who are his political base. I mean, it's hard to think of a dictator needing a political base, but that is sort of the, there are people who are terrified against standing up to Putin, and there are people who are passionate believers, and his passionate believers are these Russian Christian nationalists. And so Ioffi's contention, and she, I think, knows this infinitely better than I do, was that Gershkovich's Jewishness was part of what made him especially vulnerable. With Daniel Pearl, I have no doubt about that at all.
Is there something in particular take away for keeping understanding that my students are 12, his are a little bit older than that, but that a takeaway that they need to have from this about this particular obligation we have as Jews to redeem people who have been, especially those who've been taken without cause. Brittany Griner, we may not agree it was trumped up, but they had cause. There's doesn't appear to be any cause for Evan Gershkovich, or certainly not for these hundreds of people who are now in Gaza. Is the obligation different?
I don't think in the Judaic teaching, as I'm familiar with it, and I will defer to the rabbi on this, I don't think there's a differentiation made between, a soldier, a non-soldier, a parent, a child, any of those. It's given as a flat out statement. And when the Talmudic argument is made, you shouldn't overpay.
Right.
That's not made as you shouldn't overpay unless it's a child, or shouldn't overpay unless it's a 75-year-old peace activist. That's also given. I'm not meaning to make light, but I mean, none of these are given with carve-outs. They're given both ways as across the board statements. And I think what's so painful, and I really empathize for anyone as young as 12 or however old your students are, Rabbi, clearly no older than high school age, I assume, to have to wrestle with this at such a young age, is that it reminds me of what a friend of mine said about when people get cancer, and I'm saying this as a cancer survivor, so I think I have the right to say it. When you have cancer, it doesn't matter if someone says your probability of a cure or of survival is 33% or 70% or whatever it is. As a friend of mine whose infant son had been through cancer and survived put it, when you have cancer, there are only two percentages, 0 or 100. And when you are a hostage, there are only two percentages, 0 and 100. But everyone else on the outside who's in the negotiating process doesn't have the ability to think only in terms of 0 or 100. And the conflict between those two, the discontinuity, the clash between really two views of what the right thing to do is. The right thing is absolutely to bring back all the captives. And in theory, we say at any cost, but is the right thing to do to give in to extortion? Extortion on the level of human atrocities. Would, if Al-Qaeda had taken American hostages, would it have been worth it to give back Osama bin Laden? Those are the questions that the people in the negotiating and have to reckon with, even as if you're the relative or friend of any of those Israeli captives, then there's only 0% or 100%.
But I was thinking of the story. I can't remember if you cited in your article of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who I was actually in Rothenburg about 20 years ago, a city in southern Germany, and Rabbi Meir had been ransomed.
Yeah.
He was captured. This was in the Middle Ages.
I do have that in the article. Yeah.
I think I remember, I think it was the 13th century. And he told his community, don't ransom me because it's too much and you shouldn't do it, and that's obviously a story told of piety, but it's a hard story, I think, for us to consider today. It's
very hard, and it's very different when it's an adult who actually can communicate to people saying, I don't want you to ransom me at any cost. We don't have that. I think unfortunately, in situations like that, you get videos that are often coerced, you get letters that are written under duress, that are giving out various messages. And, it's one more way that the captives themselves are terribly exploited, is they're turned into pawns in the negotiation for their own liberation.
Right, yeah,
Anyway, I'm going to need to
yeah,
check out at this point. I've been going nonstop since early this morning, so
I know the
which is
feeling.
why I still have my suit on.
I still have my scrub pants on. You can't see that. I just changed shirts, so I look a little bit better on the
Right.
Zoom video.
well, we really appreciate your time and your insights. It's been really enlightening for us.
Well, thank you. I mean, I hope it measures up to a rabbinic level. That's all I can say, and to a Daf Yomi level.
And more.
I feel like the amateur around here.
It's good to see you, Sam.
Good to see you too, Sharon. Rabbi, really good to meet you. I hope it'll be in person next time.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope so.
Well, maybe what we'll do is we'll show this, and then the kids can give their feedback, questions, things they would like to learn more from you, and then maybe we can do a follow-up.
Yeah, either that or you could email me their questions and I can write back some answers to the best of my limited ability.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.